In 1878, a man signed a piece of paper and sold his wife to pay a gambling debt. She was put on an auction block in front of the entire town. Not one person stepped forward to help her. Then a cowboy no one had ever seen before said two words that changed everything: $500. But what he did next shocked her even more. He tore up the bill of sale and told her she was free. This is the story of how a woman who was sold for less than a horse became the one person who could not be broken. The gunshot split the Denver afternoon in half. Clara Whitfield stood on the stone steps of the Arapahoe County Jail with a signed divorce decree pressed to her chest and a Colt revolver pointed at the Colorado sky, and the smoke had not yet cleared when Virgil Cobb, the man who had tried to buy her 6 weeks ago in a dusty Wyoming square, took one step backward for the first time in his life. Behind him, two hired men reached for their belts. In front of him, Clara lowered the revolver and held his gaze without blinking. She had learned to do that. She had learned a great many things since the day a stranger in a brown leather vest tore up a bill of sale and told her she was free. But freedom, Clara had discovered, was not something a man could give you. It was something you took. And she had ridden 400 miles alone to take hers back. To understand how a woman who had stood on an auction block in Sheridan, Wyoming, with dust in her hair and nothing left to her name, ended up on the steps of a Denver jailhouse with a gun in one hand and the truth in the other, we need to go back to the beginning, back to April, back to the day the world stripped her down to nothing, and a cowboy who had no reason to stop decided he could not walk away. Sheridan, Wyoming, April 1878. The crowd gathered in the town square, the way crowds always gather for spectacles they would later deny attending. They came in clusters of 2 and 3 men, mostly their hats pulled low against the April wind. They stood near the general store, in the feed depot, and the water trough, close enough to watch, but far enough to claim they had simply been passing through. Clara Whitfield stood on the wooden platform in the center of the square and understood with a clarity that felt like a blade between her ribs that none of them would help her. The platform was not built for this purpose. It was the same stage where the town held its Independence Day speeches and its autumn harvest dances. She had stood on this very woods 6 months ago, clapping while a fiddle player sawed through a Virginia reel. Now the bunting was gone and the fiddle was silent, and the only music was the wind tearing across the plain, carrying the smell of horse dung and coming rain. Her hands shook. She gripped the rough timber post to keep herself upright. The wood bit into her palms, and she was grateful for the pain because it gave her something to feel, besides the shame that pressed down on her chest like a millstone. 3 days ago, she had still been a wife, a woman with a home, a woman whose name meant something, even if what it meant was simply the wife of Emmett Whitfield, the man with the easy laugh and the restless hands who had come west from Philadelphia, with promises stacked so high they blocked the view of what lay beneath them. 3 days ago, Emmett had disappeared. He left behind a note on the kitchen table written in his careful, slanting hand. He left behind an empty strongbox that once held their savings. He left behind a stack of gambling debts so tall that the paper, if laid end to end, might have stretched from their front porch to the saloon where he had lost it all. And he left behind a signed document, a legal paper drawn up by a man who knew enough law to make cruelty look orderly, stating that all of Emmett Whitfield's remaining property, including his land and his wife, was hereby transferred to Mr. Virgil Cobb of Sheridan, Wyoming, in full satisfaction of debts owed. His wife, listed between the acreage and a bay horse. Clara had read the document twice before the words assembled themselves into meaning. Then she had set it down on the table, walked to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with a man she thought she knew, and felt something inside her go very quiet. Not numb, quiet, the way the air goes quiet before a storm turns the sky green. She had not always been this woman. There was a time before the West, before Emmett, when Clara Reed was a girl in Boston with ink on her fingers and a mother who taught her to read wounds the way other mothers taught their daughters to read recipes. Margaret Reed had been a nurse at Massachusetts General for 22 years. She brought home the smell of carbolic acid and stories about the men she had saved, and she taught her daughter how to clean a laceration, how to set a splint, how to read a fever by the color of a person's eyes. Her father, William Reed, was a printer who loved books the way other men loved horses. He kept a small library in the front room of their narrow house on Milk Street, and on Sunday afternoons he would read aloud to Clara while her mother darned stockings by the window. Dickens, Hawthorne, the poetry of Longfellow. Words filled that house like warmth from a stove, and Clara grew up believing that language could build walls strong enough to keep the cold out. When the scarlet fever came through Boston in the winter of 1872, it took both her parents within 11 days of each other. Clara was 20 years old. She buried them in Mount Auburn Cemetery on a Tuesday morning while sleet fell sideways across the headstones. She stood alone at the graveside because there was no one else to stand with her. The minister said words about God's plan, and Clara listened without hearing because any plan that took both her parents in less than a fortnight was a plan she wanted no part of. The house on Milk Street went silent, not the silence of a place where no one speaks, but the silence of a place where the voices that mattered have stopped and will not start again. Clara moved through the rooms for weeks, touching things her parents had touched, reading the books her father had read to her, pressing her face into her mother's apron because it still smelled of carbolic acid and lavender. She ate when she remembered to. She slept when she could not stay awake. She was 20 years old and alone in a world that had not prepared her for the weight of the solitude. Emmett Whitfield appeared 4 months later, like a warm wind after a long freeze. Handsome, confident, full of plans that sounded like promises. He spoke of the West the way a preacher speaks of paradise, as something inevitable and glorious waiting just beyond the reach of ordinary vision. He said he would build her a life. He said the frontier was where a man made his fortune and a woman found her purpose. She married him because she was alone, and because his voice made the silence bearable, and because she wanted more than anything to believe that one person in this world would not leave her. They went west. The promises began to crack before they crossed the Mississippi. A flash, brief as heat lightning, Emmett's hands slamming flat against the kitchen table, the crack of his palm on wood, Clara flinching backward, her shoulders hitting the wall, his voice low and controlled, the kind of quiet that is worse than shouting, "You don't question me. You don't ever question me." The sound of a door locking from the outside, the click of the deadbolt like a period at the end of a sentence that allowed no argument. The memory dissolved as quickly as it came. Horace Pruitt, the town auctioneer, climbed the platform steps with the careful deliberation of a man who wanted everyone to see that this was not his idea. He was 60 years old, bald as a river stone, and he had auctioned cattle and land and furniture for 3 decades in Sheridan. He had never auctioned a woman. He had told Virgil Cobb exactly that when Cobb presented the papers. But Virgil had simply looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "The law is the law, Horace. I am merely exercising my legal rights." And Horace, who owed Virgil for the loan on his house, had nodded and reached for his gavel. He cleared his throat twice. He adjusted his spectacles. He unfolded the paper Virgil Cobb's lawyer had pressed into his hands that morning and read aloud in a voice that carried across the square like a sentence being handed down. "Next item, gentlemen, Mrs. Clara Whitfield, sold to settle the gambling debts of her husband, Mr. Emmett Whitfield, presently absent. Bidding starts at $50. Clara closed her eyes. $50. That was the price they had set on her life. Less than the bay horse, less than the land, less than the poker debts that had consumed everything she had ever worked for. $50 for a woman who could read Latin, who could suture a wound in the dark, who had crossed a continent on the word of a man who turned out to be made of nothing but wind. She kept her eyes closed because if she opened them, she would see their faces. The men who had tipped their hats to her outside the dry goods store. The men who had complimented her bread at the church social. The men who now stood in the April dust and calculated her worth like livestock. 50, said a voice she recognized. Virgil Cobb. She did not need to open her eyes to see him. She knew exactly what he looked like. Tall, lean, silver-haired though he was only 45. He owned the Lucky Strike Saloon and the brothel above it, and some said the sheriff who was supposed to keep order in both. He dressed like a banker and spoke like a gentleman, and there was something in his pale gray eyes that reminded Clara of a cat watching a bird through glass. A predator that enjoyed the watching more than the catching. He had been watching her for months. She had felt it the way you feel a draft through a closed window, a chill that has no visible source. At the general store, his gaze lingered a beat too long. At the church social, he appeared beside her and said in his smooth, unhurried voice, "Your husband is a fortunate man, Mrs. Whitfield. I do hope he appreciates what he has." Now she understood. Virgil had not merely collected Emmett's debts. He had cultivated them. He had extended credit the way a spider extends silk, patient and deliberate, knowing exactly what he intended to catch. 60, called another man. Clara did not recognize the voice and did not care. 75. Virgil again, calm as morning. 100, said the unknown bidder. 125. Virgil's voice carried the faintest edge of amusement. He was not bidding against the man. He was educating him, showing him and everyone else in the square that this outcome had been decided long before the auction began. Clara opened her eyes. She could not help it. Some part of her, the part her mother had raised to look at a wound before treating it, needed to see. The square was full. 40, maybe 50 people. Women watched from shop windows, their faces pressed to the glass like portraits hung in judgment. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. And the men stood in the open, some with their arms crossed, some with their hands in their pockets, and not one of them, not a single one, stepped forward to say that this was wrong. Clara felt something shift inside her. A door closing. The last room in her heart, where she had stored her faith in the decency of others, went dark, and she heard the lock turn. Then a voice she had never heard before cut through the square like a blade through burlap. $500. The words landed in the silence and detonated. Heads turned. Horace Pruitt's spectacles slid to the tip of his nose. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the prairie itself needed a moment to understand what had just been said. Clara turned toward the voice. Near the back of the crowd, leaning against the hitching post outside the blacksmith's shop, stood a man she had never seen in Sheridan. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, and still as a fence post. Trail dust coated his boots and the lower half of his canvas trousers. He wore a blue work shirt, faded at the cuffs and collar from years of sun and washing, beneath a brown leather vest that had been mended at least twice along the left seam. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed the upper half of his face, but beneath it, she could see a jaw set hard and a mouth drawn into a line that was not anger exactly, but something close to it. Something that looked like a man who had just remembered a thing he had spent years trying to forget. He straightened from the hitching post. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 500, he said again, quieter this time, as if the number were not a bid, but a verdict. The crowd parted around him the way water parts around a stone in a creek. He walked forward with the unhurried stride of a man who was accustomed to open country and hard ground, and his spurs made a sound against the packed earth that was almost musical, a small, bright jingle that seemed to belong to a different world than the one Clara was standing in. Virgil Cobb turned. For the first time that morning, something crossed his face that was not control. It was brief, a flicker behind the gray eyes, gone before most people would have noticed. But Clara noticed. She had spent 2 years learning to read the weather in a dangerous man's face, and she saw it clearly. Virgil had not expected this. 500 is a great deal of money, sir, Virgil said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something. Clara could hear the effort in it. Perhaps you are not aware of the circumstances. I am aware, the stranger said, that there is a woman standing on that platform who is not property. That is all the circumstance I need. When the silence that followed was so complete, Clara could hear the flag snapping on the pole above the general store. Virgil studied the stranger. His eyes moved from the worn vest to the trail-dusty boots to the gun belt resting low on the man's hips. Whatever calculation he performed behind those gray eyes, the result did not please him. 550, Virgil said. The stranger did not hesitate. 1,000. A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. $1,000. A man could buy a house for that. A herd of cattle. A year of his life. Virgil Cobb said nothing. His jaw tightened. His fingers resting at his sides curled once, then straightened. He looked at the stranger the way a man looks at a lock he does not yet have the key to. Then he turned without a word and walked toward the saloon. The crowd watched him go. No one spoke. A man like Virgil Cobb did not lose gracefully, and everyone in that square knew it. Going once, Horace Pruitt said quickly, as if afraid the moment might shatter. Going twice. He waited. The wind picked up. Dust swirled across the platform. Sold, to the gentleman in the back. Clara Whitfield stood on the platform with the wind pulling at her hair and stared at the man in the brown leather vest who had just spent a fortune to buy a woman he had never met. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from or why he was here or what he wanted. She knew only that his eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his hat as he approached the platform, were blue. What the pale blue of Virgil Cobb's gaze, which reminded her of ice in a ditch. These were a darker blue, the blue of deep water, and when they found hers, something in them shifted. Pain, recognition, a wound so old it had become part of the landscape of his face. He stopped at the base of the platform. He did not climb the steps. He stood below her and looked up, and there was a deliberateness to the gesture that Clara understood instinctively. He was not standing over her. He was not claiming her. He was simply there, steady and present, like a hand extended in the dark. "My name is Silas Mercer," he said. His voice was low, rough-edged, as if he did not use it often. "I would like to speak with you, Mrs. Whitfield." "Not here. Would you allow me to walk you to the hotel dining room?" Clara looked at this man with the dust on his shoulders and the mended vest and the eyes that held something she could not yet name. She looked at the crowd behind him, already whispering. She looked at Virgil Cobb's retreating back as it disappeared through the saloon doors. "I have nowhere else to go," Clara said. It was not agreement, it was the truth. The walk to the Sheridan Hotel took 4 minutes. It felt like 40. Clara kept her eyes on the wooden sidewalk, counting the planks, feeling the stairs against her back, like small stones thrown from a safe distance. Silas Mercer walked beside her without touching her, without speaking. His stride shortened to match hers, and she was aware of each presence the way you are aware of shade on a hot day. Something that changes the temperature without asking permission. Inside the dining room, he pulled out a chair for her. He waited until she sat before taking his own. He removed his hat and set it on the empty chair beside him, revealing thick brown hair that was overlong at the collar and curled slightly where the sweat had dried. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had first thought. 30, perhaps. Not more. But his eyes were older than his face, the eyes of a man who had seen something that had rearranged the order of the world and had not yet found a way to put it back. His hands rested on the table. Large hands scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the palms. Working hands. A thin white scar ran along the back of his left hand from the wrist to the base of his smallest finger. These were not the hands of a gambler or a politician. They were hands that had built things and broken things, and Clara suspected held something precious that they had failed to keep. "Would you care for tea?" he asked. She nodded. Her voice had gone somewhere she could not reach. He ordered tea and waited. He did not rush her. He did not stare. He looked at the window, at the street beyond it, at the mountains in the distance, and gave her the one thing no man had given her in 2 years: time. When the tea came, Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into her fingers. She took a breath, then another. Then she found her voice where she had lost it, somewhere in the rubble of the morning. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You paid a great deal of money for me. What do you expect?" Silas Mercer's face changed. Not with anger, with something that looked like disgust turned inward, as though the question itself wounded him. "I expect nothing," he said. "What happened today was wrong. No person should be bought or sold, not in this country, not anywhere, not ever." He reached into his vest, the brown leather creasing at the movement, and pulled out the folded bill of sale. He held it up so she could see it. Then slowly and deliberately he tore it in half. He tore those halves in half again and again until the paper lay in small pieces on the white tablecloth between them, like confetti at a funeral. "You are free, Mrs. Whitfield." Clara stared at the pieces, her vision blurred. Something cracked open inside her chest, and the sound it made was so loud she was sure he could hear it. It was the sound of a wall breaking. A wall she had built brick by careful brick over 2 years, of smiling when she wanted to scream, of saying yes, sir, when she meant no, of folding herself smaller and smaller until she almost disappeared. That wall came down, and behind it was a woman she had almost forgotten existed. Why, she managed. Why would you do this for a stranger? Silas looked at the torn paper. Something crossed his face. That same flicker she had seen when he first approached the platform. Pain, memory, a ghost walking through a room he thought he had locked. $1,000 is a fair price for doing what is right, he said quietly. And I have seen enough of the other thing to know when I cannot walk away. He paused. The silence between them was not empty. It was full the way a held breath is full, carrying everything that would come after. I have a ranch, he said, the North Star, near the Montana border. 5,000 acres of good grass and clean water. My housekeeper left recently. It is honest work with fair pay. You would have your own cabin. No expectations beyond the job. He met her eyes. Only if you want it. Clara studied him. She had learned in her years with Emmett to search for the lie behind the kindness, the hook inside the gift. She looked for it now in Silas Mercer's blue eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself upright, but not rigid strong, but not threatening. She found nothing false, and that more than anything terrified her because it meant she would have to trust again. And trusting was the thing that had brought her to the auction block in the first place. But there was something else, something beneath the fear. A small, stubborn flame that her mother had lit years ago in a narrow house on Milk Street, tended by stories of survival, fed by the belief that a woman could be more than what the world decided she was. That flame had survived Emmett. It had survived the auction block, and it was still burning. "I accept," she whispered. Silas nodded once, and something in his shoulders released a tension she had not noticed until it was gone. "Tomorrow we leave at dawn," he said. They did not see Virgil Cobb leave the square that afternoon. They did not see him walk up the stairs of the Lucky Strike Saloon to his private office on the second floor, past the faro tables in the Long Walnut Bar, and the girls who worked the rooms above, none of whom looked at him as he passed, because they had learned early that Virgil Cobb preferred not to be looked at unless he invited it. They did not see him sit at his mahogany desk, pour himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and drink it without expression. And they did not see what he took from the bottom drawer. It was a document, not the bill of sale. That paper, the one Silas Mercer had torn to pieces in the hotel dining room, was a copy, a formality. The original debt agreement, the one Emmett Whitfield had signed 6 months ago in this very office, remained in Virgil's possession, and it was far more comprehensive than the auctioneer's paper. The original document stated in language precise enough to survive any courtroom west of the Mississippi that all assets of Emmett Whitfield, including real property, chattel, and marital holdings, were pledged as collateral against his outstanding debts. Marital holdings, 2 words that in the hands of the right lawyer could mean anything, could mean everything. Virgil read the document once. He folded it carefully and returned it to the drawer. Then he took a blank telegram form from the shelf beside his desk and began to write. To J. Halloran, ESQ, Denver, Colorado. Require full background on one Silas Mercer. Rancher, believed to hold property near Montana border. Send all particulars. Spare no expense. He signed the telegram and rang for his boy. While he waited, he stood at the window and watched the street below. Somewhere out there, the cowboy in the blue shirt and brown vest was preparing to leave town with the woman Virgil had spent 6 months maneuvering into his possession. Virgil Cobb was not angry. Anger was for men who had run out of options. Virgil had options. He always had options. The cowboy had torn up a piece of paper and called it freedom. But freedom in Virgil's experience was not a piece of paper. Freedom was a legal concept, and legal concepts belonged to the men who could afford the best lawyers. He thought about the circuit judge. Judge Whitaker rode through Sheridan once every 2 months, dispensing justice from a temporary bench in the town hall. His next visit was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. That was the window. If the woman was still legally bound to Emmett's debts when the judge arrived, Virgil could file a claim. And if the cowboy objected, well, Virgil had lawyers in Denver and a sheriff in his pocket and patience enough to outlast any man who relied on principle instead of power. He sipped his bourbon and smiled. Not a wide smile, a small one. Patient. The kind of smile a man wears when he knows exactly how the game will end because he built the table and marked the cards. The boy came. Virgil handed him the telegram and a coin. Run, Dienst, he said. Clara spent the evening alone in her hotel room. Silas had paid for it along with a set of riding clothes, a warm coat, and a pair of boots that fit her better than any shoes Emmett had ever let her buy. She laid the clothes across the bed and ran her fingers over the fabric in the simple act of touching something that had been given without condition, almost undid her entirely. She sat by the window as the sun went down over Sheridan. The mountains turned purple, then black. The lights in the saloon came on one by one. Somewhere a dog barked and a man laughed and a piano began to play a melody she almost recognized. She thought about tomorrow, about the ride north, about the ranch called the North Star and the man who owned it. about the way his eyes had looked when he tore the paper as though he were not just freeing her, but settling a debt of his own. An old debt, one that had nothing to do with money. She thought about the circuit judge 6 weeks away. A woman at the general store had told her that much while Clara was buying soap for the evening. The judge comes through in late May, the woman said not unkindly. If you need legal matters settled, that is your window. Clara had thanked her and tucked the information away the way her mother used to tuck instruments into a surgical bag. Carefully, because it might be needed. She did not know what waited for her at the North Star. She did not know if Silas Mercer was everything he appeared to be or something else entirely. She had been wrong about a man before, and it had cost her everything. But she knew this much. Tomorrow she would ride out of Sheridan. She would leave behind the auction block and the whispers and the shame of being sold by a man who had promised to cherish her. She would ride north with a stranger whose name she had learned only hours ago. And if the world tried to take her freedom again, she would not stand on a platform with her eyes closed, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She would fight. Clara Whitfield turned from the window, lay down on the bed in her new clothes, and slept without dreaming for the first time in 2 years. Outside, the April wind moved across Sheridan and carried with it the sound of a telegraph machine clicking in the Western Union office. Virgil Cobb's message raced east along the wire through the dark Wyoming night, past sleeping towns and silent ranches toward Denver, and a lawyer named Halloran who would begin first thing in the morning to dismantle the freedom a cowboy had purchased for $1,000 in a torn piece of paper. The clock had started. Clara did not know it yet, but 6 weeks was all she had. They left Sheridan before the sun cleared the Bighorn Mountains. Clara wore the riding clothes Silas had bought her, a cotton blouse beneath a heavy canvas jacket, trousers that fit well enough for the saddle, and boots with low heels that gripped the stirrups as if they had been made for her feet. She carried her carpet bag tied behind the saddle of a chestnut mare named Penny, a horse so gentle that when Clara first laid her hand against the animal's neck, the mare turned her head and breathed warm air across Clara's palm like a greeting. Silas rode his black stallion a half-length ahead. He wore the same blue work shirt and brown leather vest from the day before, and Clara noticed that he had brushed the trail dust from the vest but had not replaced it with anything finer. He was a man who wore what was useful and did not think about what was handsome, though the effect she admitted to herself only briefly and only once was not unpleasant. They did not speak for the first hour. The town fell away behind them, and the land opened into rolling hills covered with sage and early grass, and the sky stretched so wide in every direction that Clara felt for the first time in years that she could breathe without asking permission. At midday, they stopped beside a creek where snowmelt ran fast and clear over smooth stones. Silas handed her jerky bread and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. He filled his canteen and offered it to her first. Small gestures, ordinary courtesies. But to a woman who had spent 2 years in a house where courtesy was a weapon disguised as kindness, these ordinary things carried a weight that Silas could not have understood. Or perhaps he did understand, and that was why he offered them so carefully, so gently, as though she might startle if he moved too fast. "How did you come to be in Sheridan?" Clara asked. It was the first full sentence she had spoken since they left. "My horse threw a shoe," Silas said. He took a drink from the canteen and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I went looking for the blacksmith. Did not plan on being anywhere near that square." "Providence, then?" "Perhaps." He looked at her, a brief look, careful, as though she were something he did not want to disturb. "Or just the right timing." They rode on. The land changed as they moved north, the sage giving way to meadows dotted with wildflowers, purple lupine and white yarrow, and the first yellow blooms of arrowleaf balsam root. Snow still capped the highest peaks, but in the valleys the grass was green and thick, and the air carried the smell of panain and wet earth. On the second evening, they stopped at a way station run by a quiet man named Granger, who fed them stew and gave them separate rooms without comment. After supper, Clara sat by the fire, aching from the long ride, and Silas brought her a cup of strong coffee and sat in the chair across from her. "Tell me about your ranch," Clara said. Silas's face warmed with something she had not yet seen on him. Pride. Not the loud, boastful kind that Emmett had worn like a coat 2 sizes too large. Quiet pride. The kind that comes from building something with your own hands and watching it survive. "The North Star," he said, 5,000 acres, Bighorn Mountains to the west. grasslands that run to the horizon, good water, good soil. My foreman and his wife live nearby, hardworking people. And how long have you had it? 6 years. Before that, I tried everything. Drove cattle, rode for the Pony Express, served as a deputy marshal for a time. A marshal, Clara said, and something in her voice that she had not expected, something that might have been a smile, surfaced briefly. Silas chuckled, a low sound, rough at the edges, as if his throat had forgotten how laughter worked. I have worn many hats, but the ranch is the one that stayed. His smile faded as he stared into the fire. The light moved across his face and turned his eyes to a deeper blue, and Clara saw something pass through them that he did not mean to show. What made you settle on ranching? She asked. My father never stayed in one place, Silas said. I grew up moving from camp to camp, towns that lasted a season, faces that changed every month. I promised myself that someday I would build something permanent, something that would still be standing when I was gone. He paused. The North Star is that promise. Clara listened to the quiet strength in his voice. She had never known a man who built his life with such deliberate care. Emmett had built nothing. He had only taken and spent and moved on, leaving wreckage behind him, the way a river in flood leaves broken fences and uprooted trees. You should rest, Silas said gently. Tomorrow is another long day. Clara rose to leave. Good night, Silas, and thank you. Good night, Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name. She carried the sound of it to bed, and it stayed with her through the night like warmth from a stove that someone had remembered to tend. Clara told him about Boston on the third day, about her parents, about the house on Milk Street in her mother's hands, which smelled of carbolic acid and were the safest thing she had ever known. She told him about Emmett, though she kept the worst of it folded away, not ready yet to lay it out in the open where the sun could reach it. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, a man who loves a woman does not sell her to pay his debts. No, Clara said, he does not. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that has gone out but is not yet cold. That night at their last camp before the ranch, Clara lay awake listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of a coyote and the sound of Silas checking the horses one last time before he turned in. She thought about trust and about the cost of giving it and the greater cost of withholding it. And she thought about how strange it was that a man she had known for 4 days had already shown her more respect than the man she had married. She was not falling in love. She told herself that clearly and firmly. She was not. She was simply learning what decency looked like after years of forgetting, and the lesson was disorienting, like stepping into sunlight after a long time in a dark room. She told herself that, and she almost believed it. They reached the North Star on the 4th day. Clara saw it first from the crest of a long hill, and the sight stopped the breath in her chest. Below them, a valley opened like a cupped hand, green and gold in the late afternoon light. A large log house sat at the center, flanked by several cabins, a bunkhouse, stables, and a corral, where horses moved in slow circles. Cattle grazed in the far fields, dark shapes against the grass. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and beyond it all, the Bighorn Mountains rose like a wall against the western sky, their peaks still white with snow. Welcome to the North Star, Silas said. Clara could not speak. She had lived in a rented house in Sheridan, with warped floors and a kitchen that smelled of Emmett's tobacco. Before that, the narrow house on Milk Street, which had been warm but small. She had never seen a place that looked like it had been built not just for shelter, but for permanence, for legacy, for something that would outlast the man who made it. It is beautiful, she whispered. Silas looked at the ranch with pride and also a kind of tender worry, as though beauty were a thing that could be lost if you did not tend it. It has been my life's work, he said simply. 6 years, every fence post, every beam. They rode down the hill and into the yard. A woman emerged from the ranch house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 55, round-faced and broad-shouldered, with gray hair pinned beneath a cotton bonnet and eyes that took Clara's measure in a single glance and apparently found the result acceptable. You must be Mrs. Whitfield, the woman said. I am Agnes Holt. I cook, I clean, I mind what needs minding, and I do not tolerate nonsense from man or beast. She took Clara's carpet bag before Clara could protest. You look like you have not eaten a proper meal in a month. Come inside." Behind Agnes, a man appeared from the stable, tall, weathered, with a beard the color of rust, and a hat so old it had forgotten its original shape. He tipped it once in Clara's direction. "Boone Dawson," he said. "Foreman. Anything you need, ma'am, you ask." Clara nodded, overwhelmed by the simple decency of these people, the ease with which they made room for her. Then she saw the girl. She was standing in the shadow of the bunkhouse, half hidden behind the doorframe, watching Clara with eyes that were neither friendly nor hostile, but something more complicated. She was young, perhaps 16, with dark hair cut short in a way that suggested impatience rather than fashion, and she held herself with the coiled tension of a person who had learned early that the world was not to be trusted. "That is Jessie Tull," Silas said quietly. "She has been here 2 years. Her parents died of fever on the trail west. I found her in Billings, living behind a feed store." He paused. "She does not warm to strangers quickly." As if to confirm this, Jessie stepped out of the shadow, looked directly at Clara, and said, "The last woman who came here promised she would stay. She was gone before the first snow." Then she turned and walked away. Agnes sighed. "That child will either end up a senator or a bank robber. I have not yet determined which." Somewhere behind Clara, Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. It was the first moment of lightness Clara had felt in months, and it caught her off guard, like finding a single wildflower pushing through a crack in frozen ground. A flash, longer this time. Clara locked in a room, the bedroom, their bedroom. Emmett's footsteps on the other side of the door, pacing, back and forth, the creak of the floorboards marking his path like a metronome. She sat on the bed with her hands in her lap and counted the steps. 14 steps to the window, 14 steps back. The lock was on the outside. He had installed it himself, whistling while he worked, as though building a cage for your wife were the same as hanging a shelf. His voice through the wood. "You made me do this, Clara. You know that. If you would just listen. If you would just be what I need you to be." The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. Then the lock clicked open, and Clara flinched so hard she bit her own tongue. The memory faded. She was standing in the cabin Silas had prepared for her at the North Star, and the door was open and no one was on the other side. The weeks that followed remade Clara in ways she had not expected. She settled into her duties with a discipline that surprised even Agnes. Mornings began before dawn with the stove, the coffee, the biscuits that Agnes taught her to make with buttermilk and a light hand. She cleaned the ranch house, organized the pantry, mended clothes, and kept the books which Silas had maintained with the earnest inaccuracy of a man who understood cattle far better than arithmetic. But it was the afternoons that changed her. On the 5th day, a ranch hand named Coulter was thrown from his horse while driving cattle from the south pasture. He came back to the bunkhouse draped over his saddle with a grisaille above his left eye that bled freely and a forearm bent at an angle that made Agnes turn pale and sit down. Clara did not sit down. She crossed the room and knelt beside the injured man and said in a voice so steady it surprised even her, "I need hot water, clean cloth, and a flat piece of wood about this long." She held her hands apart to show the length. "And whiskey, not for the wound, for him." She cleaned the gash, stitched it closed with a needle and thread from Agnes's sewing kit, and set the broken arm using the splint technique her mother had taught her on the kitchen table in Boston 12 years ago. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not change. She worked with a focus that emptied the room of everything but the task in front of her, and when she tied the last bandage and sat back, Coulter was unconscious from the whiskey and the pain, but he was stable, and the arm was set true. She looked up and found Silas standing in the doorway. He had been watching. She did not know for how long, but the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. It was not gratitude, though there was gratitude in it. It was not surprise, though there was that too. It was something deeper. The look of a man who has just discovered that the person standing in front of him is not who he thought she was, but someone larger. Someone whose edges extend beyond the frame he had built to contain them. He did not say a word. He nodded once, turned, and left. The next morning he set a wooden box on the porch railing beside her coffee cup. Inside was a Colt revolver, cleaned and oiled with a belt and holster size for a woman's waist. "Boone will teach you to shoot," Silas said, Every person on this ranch knows how to handle a firearm. No exceptions. He did not say it was for her protection. He did not say he was worried. He simply gave her the tool and the instruction and left the choice to her. Clara buckled the belt that afternoon and did not take it off until sunset. She won Jesse Tull with patience, with stillness, with the willingness to be present without demanding anything in return. Clara did not push. She did not ask questions. She simply existed in Jesse's orbit day after day until the girl's silence shifted from hostile to curious to something that resembled on the best days comfort. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening when Clara found Jessie sitting behind the stable with a book in her lap and a look on her face like a person trying to decode a foreign language. "What are you reading?" Clara asked. Jessie held up the book without looking at her. It was a battered copy of Jane Eyre missing its front cover. "I cannot get past the third chapter," Jessie said. It was the first time she had volunteered information without being asked. "The words are too long and I lose the thread." Clara sat down beside her, not too close, and said, "Would you like me to read it to you? We can stop whenever you want." Jessie said nothing for a long moment. Then she pushed the book toward Clara without meeting her eyes. Clara read aloud for an hour, her voice carrying softly through the evening air, while the horses shifted in their stalls and the sky turned from gold to violet. When she stopped, Jessie was still her knees drawn to her chest, her face unreadable. "Same time tomorrow?" Clara asked. "If you want," Jessie said, which meant yes. After that, the evenings belonged to them. Clara read, Jessie listened, and slowly, carefully, the space between them closed. Jessie began to sit closer, then to ask questions, then to laugh at the parts that were meant to be false, and once, just once, to cry at a part that was not. One night, as Clara closed the book, Jessie said quietly, "My mother used to read to me, before the fever." Clara said nothing. She reached over and laid her hand on Jessie's, and the girl did not pull away. The storm came on a Thursday night in the third week. It announced itself with a silence so complete that even the crickets stopped. Then the wind arrived, sudden and enormous, slamming into the valley like a freight train jumping its tracks. Rain followed, not falling, but driving sideways, and lightning split the sky in jagged white lines that turned the mountains into flat silhouettes against the dark. Silas pulled on his slicker and headed for the door. "Newborn calves in the north pasture. I need to bring them in." Clara stepped closer. "Please be careful." He paused at the door. The lamplight caught the worn leather of his vest and the blue fabric beneath it, and the expression on his face, which was something between surprise and gratitude, as if being asked to be careful was not a thing he was accustomed to hearing. "Will you wait up for me?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. He was gone for 3 hours. Clara waited by the window with a lamp burning, and she told herself it was because the lamp would guide him back, not because the thought of him out there in the black and the wind made something twist inside her that she was not ready to name. When he returned soaked and muddied, he was not alone. A rider from the neighboring ranch had been thrown and had lain in the rain with a broken leg until Silas found him. Clara went to work. She cleaned the wound, set the leg, kept the man warm through the night. Agnes helped. Jessie brought blankets without being asked. And in the small hours of the morning, when the storm had passed and the rider was sleeping and the house was quiet, Clara walked down the hallway to find a dry cloth for the table, and she opened the wrong door. She knew it was the wrong door the moment the lamplight reached inside. The room was untouched. A woman's dress hung on a hook behind the door, pale blue cotton, with white buttons, still holding the shape of the body that had last worn it. Books lay on the bedside table, a ribbon marking a page that would never be finished. A pair of shoes sat beside the bed, angled slightly toward each other, as though their owner had just stepped out and would return any moment. Dried flowers stood in a vase on the windowsill, their color long gone, but their form preserved petals thin as paper holding the memory of what they had been. And on the writing desk, a stack of letters. Clara did not need to read them to understand. The handwriting on the envelopes was Silas's, and the name written on each one in his careful, deliberate script was Eleanor. Eleanor Mercer. The room smelled of lavender and dust, and Clara understood, standing in the doorway with the lamp trembling in her hand, that this was not a room. It was a grave, a shrine built by a man who could not let go. Silas had built the North Star with his hands, but this room he had built with his grief, and he had sealed it shut the way you seal a wound that you know will never fully heal. "You should not be in here." Clara turned. Silas stood in the hallway, His shirt was still damp from the storm, his hair pushed back from his forehead, and his face held an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, something worse. The raw, exposed look of a man whose armor has been stripped away without warning. "I am sorry," Clara said. "I was looking for a cloth I did not know." "No one comes in here." His voice was rough, not with rage, but with the effort of holding something together that wanted very badly to come apart. "No one." Clara set the lamp on the hallway table. She did not retreat. She did not apologize again. She stood still and looked at him the way her mother had taught her to look at a wound directly and without flinching, because looking away was the same as looking through. "How long?" she asked softly. Silas did not answer for a long time. The house creaked around them. Rain dripped from the eaves. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped in its stall. "2 years," he said finally. "The fever, same one that took half the valley." He paused, his hands hung at his sides, and she saw them clench, then open, then clench again. "I tried everything. Sent for a doctor from Billings. He came too late. She was gone before he reached the porch." His voice broke on the last word, not dramatically, quietly. A branch under snow slowly bending and then giving way all at once. "I could not save her," he said. "She was right there, in that bed, and I could not do a single thing but watch." Clara felt the weight of his words settle into the space between them. She thought of her own mother who had saved hundreds of people and could not save herself. She thought of the helplessness that follows that kind of loss, the way it hollows out a person and fills the empty space with silence. "You write to her," Clara said. It was not a question. Silas looked at the door, at the room beyond it, at the letters on the desk that no one would ever read. "Every night," he whispered, "I tell her about the ranch, about the weather, about the calves in spring." He exhaled. "I know she cannot hear me. I know that. But if I stop writing, then she is truly gone, and I am not ready for that." Clara reached out and pulled the door closed, gently. The latch clicked into place, and the sound it made was soft, but in the quiet hallway it carried the weight of something enormous. "You do not have to be ready tonight," she said. Silas looked at her. In his eyes she saw not the steady, capable rancher who had bought her freedom in Sheridan. She saw the man underneath, the one who still set a place at a table for a woman who was never coming back. The one who rode the fences alone because solitude was easier than admitting that the silence in the house had become louder than anything he could build to fill it. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked down the hallway and out the front door into the night, where the rain had stopped and the stars were coming out one by one above the North Star Ranch. Clara stood alone in the hallway for a long time. Then she went to her cabin and lay in the dark and thought about two kinds of cages. The kind a man builds to trap you, and the kind a man builds to trap himself. 400 miles southeast in a rented office on Larimer Street in Denver, a lawyer named Julius Halloran opened a telegram from Sheridan and read it twice. He was a thin man with careful hands and a reputation for finding the seams in other people's lives and pulling until they came apart. Virgil Cobb paid him well, had paid him well for years, and the information Halloran had gathered on Silas Mercer was, he had to admit, more useful than he had expected. A dead wife, a ranch with no legal heir, a woman from an auction block now living under his roof, and a debt agreement signed by the woman's husband that a competent lawyer could stretch to cover nearly anything. But Virgil wanted more than a legal claim. He wanted leverage, and leverage Halloran knew came in human form. He had found her in Philadelphia. Rosalind Carey, 28, educated, beautiful in the particular way of women who knew their beauty was a tool and had learned to sharpen it. She had been engaged to Silas Mercer 3 years ago, before Eleanor, before the grief that had turned him into the man he was now. The engagement had ended, but the letters Rosalind still kept suggested that the ending had not been entirely mutual. Halloran sent a telegram to Virgil, "Found your leverage. Woman named Carey. Former fiancé, willing to travel for the right incentive." Virgil's reply came within hours. "Send her, I will provide the incentive." Rosalind and Carey arrived at the North Star 3 weeks after Clara, stepping down from a rented wagon in a traveling dress that cost more than everything Clara owned combined. She was tall, composed, and carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had never been told no in a way that stuck. She looked at the ranch house, at the stables, at the mountains beyond, and smiled the way a person smiles at something they intend to own. "I am here to see Silas," she said. Clara showed her in. Her heart beat in a place she did not expect, low and heavy like a drum struck underwater. When Silas entered the room and saw Rosalind, he stopped. His face went blank. Then something moved behind his eyes, not love, not longing, but the exhausted recognition of a man confronted by a chapter he thought he had closed. Rosalind smiled. "Hello, Silas. It has been a long time." She had brought a lawyer, a young man with new boots and a leather case full of documents. The documents claimed that Silas had made a written promise of marriage to Rosalind Carey in 1874, and that the promise constituted a binding financial commitment that entitled her to a share of any property acquired during the period of the engagement. It was a lie built on a foundation of truth. There had been a promise. There had been letters. But the engagement had ended cleanly with a settlement paid in full, and Clara knew this because she had spent the past 3 weeks organizing the ranch's financial records, and she had seen the receipt. Silas stood in the center of the room with his jaw tight and his hands at his sides, and Clara could see that he was preparing to fight this the only way he knew how, with patience and silence, in the stubborn hope that decency would prevail. But decency does not prevail against lawyers. Evidence does. Clara left the room. She walked to the study where the ranch records were kept. She opened the third drawer of the oak filing cabinet, removed a folder marked settlements, and found the document she needed. A receipt dated March 1875, signed by both Silas Mercer and Rosalind Carey, acknowledging full and final payment of all financial obligations arising from their engagement. Witnessed, notarized, unambiguous. She returned to the room. She set the receipt on the table in front of Rosalind Carey. "You have no claim here," Clara said. Her voice was steady, not loud, not angry. The voice of a woman who had learned to read documents the way her mother had taught her to read wounds carefully, thoroughly, and without flinching. "This settlement was paid in full 3 years ago. You signed it yourself, and you know that." Rosalind looked at the receipt. Her composure held, but something behind her eyes cracked. The young lawyer picked up the document, read it, and set it down again, with the expression of a man who has just realized he has been sent into battle without ammunition. "I think we are finished here," Clara said. Rosalind stood. She gathered her gloves. At the door, she paused and looked at Clara with something that was not quite respect, but was closer to it than anything else she had offered. "He was never this well defended before," Rosalind said. "He was never asked to be," Clara replied. Rosalind left. The wagon disappeared down the road in a trail of dust. Clara watched it go, then turned to find Silas standing behind her in the hallway. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her the night she set Coulter's arm. That same expression, larger than gratitude, deeper than surprise. "Where did you find that document?" he asked. "Third drawer, under a folder you mislabeled as cattle receipts." Something happened then that Clara had not seen before. Silas Mercer laughed, a real laugh, short and startled and entirely genuine, as if the sound had escaped from a room he had kept locked for a very long time. It was, Clara thought, the most human sound she had ever heard. A flash, longer now, 2 minutes in the dark, a night in Sheridan. 8 months ago, Clara cutting her hair with kitchen shears, the dark strands falling around her feet like something being shed. A carpet bag packed with one dress, one pair of stockings, the surgical kit her mother had left her. $20 stolen from Emmett's coat pocket while he slept in the chair by the stove, a bottle on the floor beside him. She opened the back door. The night air hit her face. Freedom was 30 steps away, across the yard, and through the gate and down the road to the train depot, where a midnight freight would take her east. She made it to the gate. Emmett's hand closed around her arm. He had not been asleep. He had been waiting. Testing her the way he tested everything to see if she would try so that he could prove she could not succeed. He did not shout. He never shouted. He simply led her back inside, locked the door, and said in that soft, controlled voice, "Now you know, there is no leaving Clara. There is only learning to stay." The memory ended. Clara was sitting on the porch of her cabin at the North Star, watching the sun go down, and her arm ached in the place where Emmett's fingers had left bruises that took 3 weeks to fade. But she was here now, and the door was open, and no one was waiting behind it. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday 4.5 weeks after Clara came to the North Star, 10 days before the circuit judge was due in Sheridan. Silas brought it to her in the kitchen. His face told her the news before the words did. "Emmett has been arrested in Denver," he said. "Fraud. Multiple charges across 3 states. Clara set down the cup she was holding. Good. There is more. Silas placed the telegram on the table. He has told the authorities that you were his accomplice, that you helped him plan the swindles, that you shared in the profits. The words landed on Clara like stones dropped from a height. She read the telegram twice the same way she had read the document Emmett left behind on the kitchen table 3 days before the auction. Slowly, carefully, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less terrible. They did not rearrange. There is more, Silas said again, and his voice was tight now, the muscles in his jaw working against each other. Virgil Cobb posted bail. Emmett is out, and Virgil is bringing him to Sheridan to testify against you when the judge arrives. Clara stared at the telegram. 2 men, 2 enemies, working together. Emmett, who had sold her, and Virgil, who had tried to buy her, now united by the single thing they shared, the belief that Clara Whitfield was something to be used. The judge comes in 10 days, Clara said. Yes. If I do not have proof that I am innocent before then, Virgil files his claim and Emmett testifies against me. I lose everything. Yes. Clara looked at Silas, at his face drawn tight with worry, at his hands resting on the table steady but not relaxed. She saw what he was about to say before he said it because she had come to know this man over 4 weeks of shared suppers in quiet evenings in long rides along the fence line, and she knew that his instinct would be to put himself between her and the danger the way he put himself between the calves and the storm. We will go to Denver, he said, together. We will face this. Clara shook her head. No, the words sat between them. Silas blinked. I will go to Denver, Clara said. Alone, you stay here. Protect the ranch. Protect Jesse. She met his eyes. I need to do this myself, Silas. If someone else saves me, it is not freedom. It is just a different kind of debt. Silas looked at her for a long time. She watched the argument form behind his eyes and watched him choose with visible effort not to make it. She watched him reach the same conclusion she had reached, that the woman standing in front of him was not the woman who had stood on the auction block in Sheridan. That woman had been trembling. This woman was not. You are certain, he said. I am certain. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers, large and warm, and roughened by the same work that had built the ranch around them. His fingers trembled just slightly, and the tremor told her more than any words he could have spoken. Then you ride at first light, he said. Make Penny. She knows the road south. He squeezed her hand once and released it. And come back to us, Clara. Come back to this place. It was the closest he had come to telling her what she already knew, what they both knew, what had been building between them since the first evening on the porch, since the night of the storm, since the moment she pulled Eleanor's door closed and told him he did not have to be ready tonight. Clara turned her hand over and held his for 3 seconds. Then she let go. I will come back, she said. She packed her carpet bag that night. She placed inside it the surgical kit her mother had given her, the receipt from the Rosalind settlement, and every piece of paper from the ranch's files that mentioned Emmett Whitfield or Virgil Cobb. She cleaned the revolver Silas had given her and loaded it and set it beside the bag. In the morning before the sun was up, she saddled Penny and rode south. Agnes Pereira pressed a bundle of food into her hands and whispered, Give them hell, child. Boone tipped his hat. Jessie stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her chin up and said nothing at all, which was from Jessie, Tull, the highest form of respect. And Silas stood in the yard in his blue work shirt and brown leather vest and watched her go. He did not wave, he did not call out. He stood there with the mountains behind him and the morning light on his face, and Clara looked back once, just once, and saw in his expression not the man who had bought her freedom in Sheridan, but the man who was letting her ride toward danger because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some doors you have to walk through alone. The road to Denver stretched south through the greening valley. Clara Whitfield rode it with her back straight and her eyes forward, and the revolver on her hip, and the evidence in her bag, and a heart that beat not with fear, but with the steady, determined rhythm of a woman who had finally learned the difference between being saved and saving herself. Behind her, the North Star Ranch grew small against the foothills. Ahead, the road wound toward a city where 2 men waited to take everything from her. She was not afraid. She had been afraid before in a locked room with footsteps on the other side of the door. She had been afraid on an auction block with 50 people watching and none of them willing to speak. She was not afraid now. She was ready. Denver in late May smelled of coal smoke and horse manure and the faint metallic sweetness of the river, running brown with mountain snowmelt through the center of the city. Clara Whitfield arrived on the afternoon of the third day, sore from the saddle and covered in trail dust, and tied Penny to the rail outside a boarding house on Blake Street, where a woman with kind eyes and tobacco-stained fingers charged 50 cents a night and did not ask questions. She washed her face in the basin. She changed into the one clean blouse she had packed. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened her carpet bag and laid out its contents across the quilt with the deliberate precision of a woman preparing for war. The surgical kit her mother had given her, which she would not need today, but carried because it reminded her who she was. The receipt proving Rosalind Carey's settlement had been paid in full, which she would not need either, but which reminded her what she was capable of. The ranch financial records showing every transaction Emmett Whitfield had made through Virgil Cobb's saloon. A letter from the Cheyenne Telegraph Office confirming the dates and destinations of telegrams Emmett had sent to co-conspirators in 3 states, none of which mentioned Clara or any woman at all. And a sworn affidavit from a clerk at the First National Bank of Sheridan stating that Clara Whitfield had never held an account, never signed a document, and never received a single dollar from any of Emmett's dealings. She had gathered every piece of it herself over 4 weeks at the North Star, in the hours between her duties. She had written letters to banks and telegraph offices and county clerks in Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. She had been patient. She had been precise. She had used the skills her father had given her, literacy and logic, and the skills her mother had given her, observation and calm under pressure, and she had built a case the way her mother built a splint strong enough to hold. Clara looked at the papers on the bed. She thought about the woman who had stood on the auction block in Sheridan with her eyes closed, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. That woman would not have known where to begin. That woman had believed in the deepest and most broken part of her heart that she was what Emmett had told her she was: small, dependent, incapable of surviving without a man to tell her which direction to face. That woman was gone. Clara gathered the papers, placed them in the leather folder Silas had given her before she left the ranch, and walked out into the Denver afternoon to find a lawyer. His name was Aldrich Stowe. He was 53 years old, lean as a fence rail with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and a mustache that drooped past his chin in a way that made him look perpetually disappointed. His office was on the second floor of a brick building on Larimer Street, 3 doors down from the office of Julius Halloran, Virgil Cobb's lawyer, a proximity that Clara did not learn until later, and that Aldrich Stowe, when he did learn it, found quietly amusing. He listened to Clara's story without interruption. He read every document she had brought. He made notes in a small leather journal with a penton that he sharpened twice during the meeting, each time blowing the shavings off his desk with the careful breath of a man who valued precision above all other virtues. When she finished, he set down his pencil and looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Whitfield, you have done in 4 weeks what most of my colleagues could not accomplish in 4 months." He tapped the stack of papers. "This is not merely a defense. This is a demolition. Emmett Whitfield's accusation will not survive first contact with this evidence." "And Virgil Cobb?" Clara asked. Stowe leaned back in his chair. "Cobb is the more dangerous problem. His debt agreement with your husband uses language that is deliberately vague. Marital holdings is not a legal term with settled meaning in Wyoming territory. A sympathetic judge could interpret it broadly. An unsympathetic one could dismiss it. And Judge Whitaker is honest, which means he will follow the evidence. If you can demonstrate that you had no knowledge of your husband's debts, that you received no benefit from them, and that the so-called transfer of your person was conducted without your consent, Whitaker will void the agreement." He paused. "But you will need to say it yourself, in front of the judge, in front of Emmett, in front of Virgil Cobb." Clara met his eyes. "I know. They will try to break you," Stowe said. "Not unkindly. Simply as fact." "They have tried before," Clara said. "It did not hold." Something changed in Aldrich Stowe's face. The perpetual disappointment softened into something that might, under different light, have been admiration. "Very well," he said. "Let us begin." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, organizing the evidence, preparing the legal filings, and drafting a letter to the United States Marshal's office in Denver detailing the fraudulent detention order that Clara suspected Virgil Cobb would attempt to use. When they finished, Stowe walked Clara to the door of his office and shook her hand. "One more thing," he said. "If Cobb approaches you before the hearing, do not engage. Do not speak. Do not argue. Simply walk away and find the nearest representative of the law." He looked at her evenly. Men like Virgil Cobb do not lose gracefully, and they are most dangerous when they realize they are about to lose. Clara thanked him and stepped into the Denver evening. The street lights were coming on. The mountains to the west were dark against a sky that still held the faintest trace of pink. She walked back to the boarding house with the folder under her arm and the revolver on her hip, and she felt for the first time since the auction like a woman with solid ground beneath her feet. The full memory came that night, not in fragments, not in flashes, the whole thing unspooling in the dark of the boarding house room like a thread pulled from a garment that had been holding her together for years. Boston, the narrow house on Milk Street, her mother's hands, her father's voice reading Longfellow by the window on a Sunday afternoon, the scarlet fever that turned the house from warm to cold in 11 days, the funeral where the sleet fell sideways and no one stood beside her. Emmett arriving like spring after a killing frost, his smile, his confidence. The way he said her name, Clara, as though the word itself were something precious, something only he knew how to pronounce correctly. The wedding, the train west, his hand on her back at the station in Cheyenne guiding her forward, and how she had mistaken control for tenderness because she had never learned the difference. The gambling, at first small, then consuming. The debts that multiplied in the dark like insects. The nights he came home smelling of whiskey and cigarette smoke and sat at the kitchen table counting money that was never enough. The first time he raised his voice. The first time he locked the door. The first time she understood with a sickness that started in her stomach and spread to every corner of her body that the man she had married did not love her. That he had never loved her. That she was a possession he maintained because she was useful, and that the day she stopped being useful would be the day he found a new use for her. The night she tried to run. The kitchen shears, the carpet bag, $20 in a plan, and the back door open and freedom 30 steps away. His hand on her arm at the gate, the lock clicking behind her, and then the note. 3 days before the auction. His handwriting on the kitchen table. Gone. Debts. Paper. Virgil Cobb. The memory released her. Clara lay in the dark breathing. The pillow was wet. She had been crying without knowing it the way the body sometimes does, what the mind refuses to expressing the grief that the will holds at bay. She wiped her face. She got up. She drank water from the pitcher. She looked at the leather folder on the desk and at the revolver beside it and at the window beyond, where the Denver night was loud with saloon music and wagon wheels and the distant whistle of a freight train heading east. She was not that woman anymore. She had been her once. She had been the girl in Boston and the bride on the train and the wife behind the locked door and the woman on the auction block. She had been all of those women, and each one had given her something. The girl gave her knowledge. The bride gave her hope. The wife gave her endurance. The woman on the block gave her rage, and the woman standing now in a Denver boarding house with evidence in a folder and a gun on the desk and a ranch waiting for her 4 days' ride to the north, that woman took everything the others had given her and forged it into something none of them could have imagined. Clara Whitfield went back to bed and slept until dawn. The Arapahoe County Jail sat on a dirt street 2 blocks from the courthouse. It was a stone building with narrow windows and an iron door that groaned when the deputy pulled it open. Inside, the air was close and stale and smelled of sweat and old food and the particular hopelessness that collects in places where men wait for their lives to be decided by other men. Emmett Whitfield was brought to the visitor's room in shackles. He had been out on Virgil's bail for a week, but a new charge, forgery, had put him back inside 2 days ago. His suit was wrinkled. His hair, once so carefully groomed, hung lank across his forehead, but his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating. The eyes of a man who was always looking for the angle. He saw Clara and smiled. "Well," he said, settling into the chair across from her, with the ease of a man sitting down to a card game. "Look at you. New clothes, new confidence." He tilted his head. "Let me guess, the cowboy." Clara did not react. She had practiced this moment in her mind 100 times on the ride from the North Star. She had imagined his voice, his smile, the way he would try to slip under her skin through the cracks he had spent 2 years carving. She had prepared for it the way her mother prepared for surgery by studying the wound before making the first cut. "I am here to offer you a choice," Clara said. Her voice was level. She placed the leather folder on the table between them but did not open it. "You can sign the divorce papers and withdraw your statement accusing me of conspiracy, or you can refuse and I will present this evidence to the district attorney." Emmett's smile did not waver. "What evidence?" Clara opened the folder. She laid out the documents one by one. The bank records showing she had never held an account. The telegraph logs proving Emmett's communications with his co-conspirators mentioned no accomplice. The affidavit from the Sheridan bank clerk. The transaction records from Virgil Cobb's saloon showing that every debt was incurred by Emmett alone, with no cosigner, no witness, no mention of his wife. Emmett looked at the papers. His smile faded by degrees the way lamplight fades when the oil runs low. Not all at once, gradually, until what remained was not charm or confidence, but the bare, stripped-down face of a man who had run out of cards. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "I wrote letters. I asked questions. I read documents." Clara folded her hands on the table. "The things you told me I was too stupid to understand." The words hit him. She saw it. A flinch, small and involuntary, the mirror of all the flinches he had caused in her. "Sign the papers, Emmett. Withdraw the accusation." He leaned back. The shackles clinked against the chair. "And if I do not, then the district attorney receives evidence of fraud in Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. 3 states, 3 sets of charges. You will not see daylight for 15 years. Virgil will not allow it. He has lawyers. Virgil's lawyers are built on Virgil's money, and Virgil's money comes from a saloon and a brothel and a series of debt agreements that I suspect the territorial authorities would find very interesting if someone were to draw their attention." Clara paused. "I have already written the letter. It is sealed and addressed. If I do not return to Sheridan within 10 days, it will be mailed." Emmett stared at her. She watched him search her face for the woman he remembered. The quiet one, the compliant one, the one who flinched at the sound of his footsteps and apologized for things that were not her fault and believed because he had told her so many times that she could not survive without him. He did not find her. "You have changed," he said, and for the first time, his voice held something that was not manipulation. It was recognition. The grudging acknowledgement of a man who has underestimated his opponent and is only now too late beginning to understand the cost. "No," Claire said. "I have remembered who I was before you." The silence stretched. Emmett looked at the papers. He looked at Clara. He looked at the walls of the jail cell that waited for him beyond the door. "Give me a pen," he said. He signed the divorce papers. He signed the withdrawal of his accusation. He signed each document with the same careful slanting hand that had written the note on the kitchen table 5 weeks ago, and when he was done, he set the pen down and looked at Clara one last time. "He is a better man than me," Emmett said. "Your cowboy." "Yes," Clara said, "he is." She gathered the papers, placed them in the folder, and stood. She did not say goodbye. She did not thank him. She walked to the door and opened it and stepped into the hallway and did not look back. Behind her, she heard Emmett say very quietly to no one, "I know." The sunlight hit her face when she stepped outside, and for a moment she could not see. She stood on the stone steps of the jail with the folder pressed to her chest and the revolver on her hip, and the May sun turning the dust on Larimer Street to gold, and she breathed. Then a voice said, "Mrs. Whitfield." Clara's hand went to the revolver, not from panic, from instinct. Virgil Cobb stood at the bottom of the steps. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, large and hard-faced, the kind of men who did work that required no skill beyond willingness. Behind them, a wagon waited with a driver who did not look at Clara. Virgil was dressed as always. Pressed suit, silver watch chain, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture that of a man conducting a business meeting. But his eyes were different. The patient amusement was gone. What remained was something colder and older and less interested in appearances. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Virgil said. His voice was soft, the softness of a man who has decided that civility is no longer necessary. "A debt is a debt, Mrs. Whitfield. Your husband owed me. The law is quite clear." "The law is clear," Clara said, "and it does not support your claim. The divorce is signed. The accusation is withdrawn. You have nothing. Virgil smiled, that small, patient smile. I have this, he said, and reached into his coat. He produced a folded document. An order of detention, signed by a justice of the peace in Sheridan, authorizing me to take you into custody pending resolution of the debt. Clara looked at the document. She looked at Virgil. She looked at the two men beside him, their hands resting at their belts. That order is not valid in Denver, she said. Perhaps not, but Denver is a long way from anyone who would care to check. Virgil took a step forward. Come quietly, Mrs. Whitfield. This does not have to be unpleasant. Clara drew the revolver. She did not point it at Virgil. She pointed it at the sky and fired once. The shot cracked through the afternoon like a branch snapping in a storm. Pigeons exploded from the courthouse roof. Heads turned on the street. Windows opened. And from the corner of Larimer and F Street, a man in a blue work shirt and brown leather vest stepped into view. Silas and Mercer. He was not supposed to be here. She had told him to stay at the ranch. She had told him she needed to do this alone. And she had meant it, and he had respected it, and yet here he was, because there are promises a man makes with his words, and promises a man makes with his heart, and sometimes the heart does not listen to the words. But it was not Silas who ended it. Behind him, moving at a pace that suggested authority rather than urgency, came a man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshal Harlan Briggs of the Denver City Police. Clara had visited his office the day before. She had shown him the forged detention order that she suspected Virgil would use. She had provided evidence that Virgil Cobb had falsified legal documents in at least 2 jurisdictions. She had done what her mother had taught her to do with every wound. Clean it first, then close it. Mr. Cobb, the marshal said, I believe we need to have a conversation about some documents that have come to my attention. Virgil's composure held for 3 seconds. Clara counted them. 3 seconds of the old confidence, the old control, the belief that money and lawyers and patience could overcome any obstacle. Then his eyes moved from the marshal to Clara to Silas and back to Clara, and he understood in those 3 seconds that the game had changed. That the table he had built and the cards he had marked were no longer in play. That the woman standing on the steps of the jail was not the woman who had stood on the auction block in Sheridan. The 2 men beside him stepped back. They were hired muscle, not loyalists, and hired muscle knows when the pay is no longer worth the risk. Marshal Briggs took Virgil Cobb by the arm. Virgil did not resist. He straightened his cuffs, he adjusted his watch chain, and as he was led toward the marshal's office, he looked back at Clara one last time. He said nothing, but his silence for the first time was not patient. It was defeated. Clara holstered the revolver. Her hands were shaking now. The shaking she had not allowed herself during the jail visit, during the confrontation, during the moment the gun went off. It came now all at once, the body's delayed response to danger that the mind had refused to acknowledge. Silas was beside her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and far enough that the choice to close the distance was hers. You were supposed to stay at the ranch, she said. I know. I told you I needed to do this alone. You did do it alone. His voice was quiet, rough. I did not arrive until it was over. I was 2 streets away when I heard the shot. He paused. I was not going to interfere. I was just going to be close, in case. Clara looked at him, at the dust on his boots and the sun on the worn leather of his vest, and the expression on his face which was not pride or relief or satisfaction, but something more vulnerable than all of those. It was the look of a man who has just watched the most terrifying thing he has ever seen and the most beautiful thing he has ever seen, and they were the same thing. Eleanor, she said softly, you could not save Eleanor, and you were afraid you could not save me. His jaw tightened, his eyes went bright, and he blinked once hard the way a man blinks when he is trying to keep something inside that wants very badly to come out. My mother, he said. Clara went still. Not just Eleanor. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. My mother. When I was 10 years old. My father was a drunk and a debtor. When the money ran out, he traded her to a man he owed. The way you trade a horse. The way Emmett traded you. The street noise fell away. The wagons and the voices and the distant sound of a piano in a saloon all faded until there was nothing in the world but Silas Mercer standing on a street in Denver with a truth he had carried for 20 years, finally reaching the air. She died 5 years later, he said, in a boarding house in St. Louis, alone. I was 15. I got there 2 days too late. He exhaled. The sound was long and ragged, as if something inside him had been holding its breath for 2 decades and was only now remembering how to release. I have spent every day since then trying to build something that would make up for the fact that I could not save her. The ranch, the fences, the cattle, the life, all of it, every board and every nail. Because if I built something good enough, maybe the weight of what happened to her would not crush me. Claire understood now. The auction block, the $1,000, the torn paper, the way his face had changed when he first saw her on the platform. He had not been looking at a stranger. He had been looking at his mother, at the thing he could not undo, at the debt that no amount of money or land or silence could repay. Until now. You did not save me, Silas, Clara said. You gave me the chance to save myself. That is not the same thing, and it is worth more. He looked at her. The brightness in his eyes spilled over just once a single trail down his cheek that he wiped away with the back of his hand. It was the first time she had seen him weep, and it did not diminish him. It made him larger. It made him real. It made him the man she had been falling in love with since the moment he stood below an auction platform and refused to climb the steps. I know, he said. That is why. The space between them was very small now. Clara closed it. She took his hand, the scarred hand, the hand that had built a ranch and torn a paper and written letters to a dead wife every night for 2 years, and she held it. Take me home, she said. They did not leave Denver immediately. Silas took her to supper at a hotel dining room, the same kind of quiet room where he had first offered her freedom 5 weeks ago. They sat across from each other, and this time Clara's voice was not stuck in her throat, and her hands did not shake, and the tea was not a lifeline, but simply tea. They talked, not about Virgil or Emmett or the law, about the ranch, about the calves that had been born during the storm, about Agnes's biscuits and Boone's ongoing argument with the gate that refused to stay latched, and Jesse's progress through Jane Eyre, which had reached the part where the heroine discovers her own strength, a detail that made Clara smile in a way that Silas noticed and did not forget. After the meal, as they stepped out into the Denver evening, the sky was streaked with pink and gold above the mountains to the west. The street was quieting. A lamplighter moved from post to post, trailing small pools of yellow light behind him, like a man planting stars in the ground. Silas stopped walking. Clara felt the change in him before she saw it. A gathering. A decision arriving at the surface after a long journey from somewhere deep. I was going to wait, he said. His voice was unsteady. She had never heard it unsteady before. Not in the auction square with 50 people watching. Not in the storm with the wind tearing at the roof. Not in the hallway outside Eleanor's room. This was new. This was the sound of a man standing at the edge of everything he wanted and being afraid for the first time that wanting was not enough. I was going to wait until we were home, until the mountains were behind us and the porch light was on and the moment was right. He took a breath. But I have learned that moments do not wait for you to be ready. They come when they come. And if you do not reach for them, they pass. He reached into the pocket of his vest. The brown leather vest mended twice along the left seam, worn through at the edges, carrying the dust of 1,000 miles, and the memory of every day since a cowboy walked into a town square and spent everything he had on a woman he did not know. He dropped to one knee on the sidewalk of Latimer Street. In his hand was a ring, simple, gold. A band that had belonged to his mother, the one thing she had managed to keep, the one thing that had found its way back to him after she died in a boarding house in St. Louis. Clara Whitfield, he said, I did not buy you, I did not save you, and I am not asking you to be mine because you are your own and you always will be. But if you would allow me to walk beside you for as long as the road goes, I would be grateful for every step. Clara looked at this man on his knee in the lamplight. She looked at the ring and the vest and the blue eyes that had seen her, truly seen her from the first moment in the square. She looked at the scar on his hand and the dust on his boots and the way his fingers trembled around the ring, and she thought about every road that had brought her here. The house on Milk Street, the train west, the locked door, the auction block, the torn paper, the North Star, the storm and the letters and the room that smelled of lavender and the girl who read Jane Eyre in the evening light. Every road, every loss, every small act of courage that she had not recognized as courage until this moment. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Silas Mercer, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been waiting there in his pocket across all the years and all the miles for exactly this hand. And then he kissed her, gently, on a street in Denver while the lamplighter moved on and the last of the sunset burned itself out above the mountains, and the world for one held breath was nothing but two people who had come through the fire and found each other on the other side. The wedding at the North Star was a celebration the valley would remember for years. They married in October beneath the golden canopy of cottonwood trees that lined the creek behind the ranch house. The mountains stood witness to the west, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of autumn. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves and the cold, clean promise of the season turning. Agnes Holt wept openly and without apology, pressing a handkerchief to her face with one hand and gripping Jesse's arm with the other. Boone Dawson stood beside Silas in a suit that looked like it had been borrowed from a smaller, more civilized man, but he wore it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. And when Silas looked at him before the vows, Boone nodded once, and that nod held 6 years of shared work and the unspoken understanding of men who do not say much but mean everything they do say. Jessie Tull carried wildflowers. She did not cry, though her eyes were bright, and when Clara hugged her after the ceremony, Jessie held on for a long time and said very quietly, "You stayed." "I stayed," Clara said. The valley folk came, ranchers and their wives, cowboys from the neighboring spreads, the blacksmith from Sheridan, who had shod Silas's horse on the day that changed everything. They ate Agnes's cooking and drank cider and danced to a fiddle player who had driven 40 miles for the occasion. And as the evening deepened and the lanterns swayed in the autumn breeze, Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the people who had become her family and the land that had become her home, and she felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for as long as she could remember. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too small a word. It was belonging, the knowledge that she was standing in the right place at the right time with the right person and that she had earned every step of the journey that brought her here. That evening, after the guests had gone and the lanterns were burning low, and the music had faded to the sound of the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods, Silas walked into the ranch house and opened the door to Eleanor's room. Clara watched from the hallway. She did not follow. This was his. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The lamplight reached into the room and touched the dress on the hook and the shoes by the bed and the letters on the desk. Everything in its place. Everything preserved. The museum of a grief that had kept him company through 2 years of silence. Then he walked to the writing desk, opened the drawer, and took out the stack of letters he had written to a woman who could not read them. He held them against his chest. He looked at the dress on the hook and the ribbon in the book and the dried flowers in the vase. He placed the letters back in the drawer. Gently, the last gesture of a grief that had finally found its resting place. He picked up the vase of dried flowers and carried it to the windowsill in the front room where the morning light would reach it. He set it down with care because some things are finished but never forgotten, and the distinction matters. He walked back to Eleanor's room. He stood in the doorway one last time. He was not saying goodbye. He had said goodbye 1,000 times in 1,000 letters that would never be read. He was saying something else, something harder and more necessary. He was saying that he was ready now, that he could let the door stay open without the room swallowing him whole, that loving someone new did not erase the woman he had loved before, but built upon her memory the way new growth rises from soil that has been burned and begins slowly to turn green again. He stepped out, and for the first time in 2 years, he left the door open. Clara took his hand. They walked out onto the porch together. The night sky above the North Star Ranch was vast and black and filled with more stars than Clara had ever seen, each one burning with the steady, patient light of something that had survived the dark. Years later, on a warm evening in late summer, Clara and Silas sat beside the lake at the eastern edge of the ranch. The water was still. The mountains reflected on its surface like a painting laid flat against the earth. Jessie, 19 now and sharper than a new fence wire, had ridden to Billings that morning to file papers for the teaching certificate she had earned through 2 years of study and stubbornness. Agnes was in the kitchen, singing a hymn she remembered from her girlhood in Missouri. Boone was mending a gate and arguing with a horse about who had the right of way. The ranch was alive, the way a good place is alive, not loud, Not showy, just steady and warm, and full of the ordinary miracles that accumulate when people choose to build something together instead of tearing each other apart. Clara leaned against Silas's shoulder. His arm went around her, and she felt the rough fabric of the brown leather vest against her cheek and the steady beat of his heart beneath it. She thought about this girl in Boston who had lost everything, and the woman in Sheridan who had been sold for less than a horse, and the woman in Denver who had stood on the steps of a jailhouse and fired a shot that cracked the sky open. She thought about all the women she had been and all the roads she had walked and the man who had walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, but beside, and who had understood from the beginning that the greatest gift you can give another person is not rescue, but room. You bought my freedom, she said softly, but you gave me a life worth living. Silas kissed her forehead. His lips were warm and his breath smelled of coffee and evening air, and when he spoke, his voice was the low, rough-edged voice of a man who had learned, after a long time and at great cost, that the thing you build with your hands is not the thing that saves you. The thing that saves you is the thing you allow yourself to love. No, Clara, he said, you saved mine. The sun went down behind the Bighorn Mountains. The stars came out above the North Star Ranch, the same stars that had watched over this valley long before any fence was built or any name was given, and that would go on watching long after the last fence fell and the last name was forgotten. But for now, in this moment, they shone on two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of places on an auction block in a dusty Wyoming town, and who had built from that broken beginning a life that neither of them had dared to imagine. The North Star burned brightest of all. It always had, not because it was the largest or the closest, but because it was the one you could count on, the one that did not move, the one that told you where you were when everything else had been taken away. Clara closed her eyes. Silas held her close. And the night settled over the ranch like a quilt laid down by gentle hands, warm and heavy, and made as all the best things are from pieces that were once broken and are now finally whole.